The air in the makeshift church was thick with dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, each one a tiny witness to a grand cruelty. Ilara stood bone-still, her small hand clutching the even smaller one of her brother, Finn. He was a silent shadow pressed against her leg, his knuckles white around the worn wooden bird his father had carved for him before the fever took him. Her uncle, Jedediah, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, gave her shoulder a sharp, proprietary shove. It was meant to propel her forward, to seal the transaction. Before her stood Silas, the groom. The town's whispers had painted him in broad, unkind strokes, a lumbering ox, a simpleton, a man too chubby to find a wife by any means other than a forced bargain. He was large, yes, his frame straining the seams of a borrowed suit coat, but as Ilara met his gaze, she saw none of the dullness the gossip promised. She saw only a vast, deep-seated shame, a quiet humiliation that mirrored her own. The preacher, his voice dripping with false piety, rushed through the words, eager to be done with the spectacle. The crowd tittered, their amusement a foul taste in the air. "I do," Jedediah answered for her, his voice a gravelly pronouncement of her fate. But the preacher looked at Ilara, waiting. She felt Finn tremble, and the feeling shot up her arm like a bolt of lightning, forging steel in her veins. She would not crumble for their entertainment. She looked past the sneering faces, past her uncle's triumphant glare, and directly at Silas. She saw a man, not a punchline. A man drowning. Her voice, when it came, was not the whisper of a victim, but a clear, steady drop of water in a silent well. "I do." The word hung in the air, defiant and unexpected, silencing the whispers. The joke had fallen flat. For in that moment, she was not just accepting a cruel fate, she was choosing her battlefield, and her first act of war was an offer of dignity to the man who was supposed to be her punishment. The journey to his farm was a long, rattling prayer of silence. The wagon creaked and groaned over the rutted track, a mournful sound that seemed to pull the very color from the sky, leaving it a washed-out canvas of gray. Ilara sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, one arm wrapped around Finn, who had buried his face in the folds of her worn dress, refusing to look at the harsh, unforgiving landscape that unspooled around them. The land was all rock and scrub, punctuated by skeletal trees that clawed at the horizon. It felt like the edge of the world, a place where hope came to die. Silas sat at the front, his broad back a formidable wall. He had not spoken a single word since they left the church. His silence was different from Finn's. It wasn't born of trauma, but of something older, heavier. It was a silence built brick by brick over a lifetime of ridicule. Yet, Ilara watched his hands. They were large, calloused, but they held the leather reins with a surprising gentleness, his movements economical and sure as he guided the two weary horses. He didn't whip them or curse them, a low murmur, a soft click of the tongue was all it took. It was a language of quiet respect, a courtesy he extended to his animals that, she suspected, the world had rarely extended to him. Hours later, the wagon crested a final, dusty rise. Below them, nestled in a hollow, was the farm. Her heart, a small, frightened bird in her chest, sank. The homestead was a portrait of neglect, a collection of tired, silvered buildings leaning against the wind. A portion of the barn roof had collapsed, and the cabin itself looked small and desolate, its windows like vacant eyes. This was it. This was her cage. For a fleeting second, the steel in her spine wavered, the cold tendrils of despair licking at her resolve. She had traded one prison for another, and this one felt infinitely more lonely. The inside of the cabin was even more bleak than the outside suggested. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, and the air was stale with disuse. A single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, furnished with only a sagging rope bed, a rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs, and a cold, cavernous stone fireplace. The weight of her uncle's final act of cruelty settled upon her. He had taken her mother's locket and the last few coins she had sewn into the hem of her dress, leaving her utterly destitute. She and Finn had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the small bundle containing her mother's quilt. As darkness seeped into the small cabin, a heavy, awkward tension filled the space between them. Where would they sleep? The question hung, unspoken. Silas seemed to feel it. Without a word, he moved to the lone bed, pulled the thin, patched blanket from it, and laid it on the floor in the farthest, coldest corner of the room. He then gestured with a slight nod of his head toward the bed, a silent offering. He was giving them, the strangers foisted upon him, the only comfort he possessed. Ilara watched him settle his large frame onto the hard floorboards, turning his face to the wall. He made himself small, trying to take up as little space as possible in his own home, an act of ingrained apology for his very existence. A profound and unexpected wave of something other than fear washed over her. It was a complex, aching pity. She moved quietly, tucking a sleeping Finn into the bed, then unrolled her mother's quilt. The quilt, with its faded but carefully stitched squares, was her last tangible piece of warmth, of home. She draped it over her brother, then sat at the table in the pale moonlight, threading a needle. She found a small tear in the quilt's border and began to stitch it closed, her movement slow and deliberate. Each stitch was a tiny rebellion, a quiet declaration that even in this desolate place, she would mend what was broken. She would make a home. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of quiet observation. A fragile truce, unspoken and unnegotiated, settled over the dilapidated farm. Ilara rose with the sun, her movements soft so as not to wake the two silent males in her care. She swept the dust from the cabin, aired out the musty bedding, and learned the geography of Silas's meager pantry. There wasn't much, but she made do, stretching flour and dried beans into simple, nourishing meals. Finn remained her shadow, his hand always clutching the small wooden bird, his eyes wide and watchful. He still did not speak, but the terror that had clung to him like a shroud was slowly beginning to recede. He would now sit on the porch step, watching Silas from a safe distance. And Ilara watched him, too. She learned that Silas was a man who spoke through action. He was rebuilding the collapsed wall of the barn, not with wood, but with stone. He worked from dawn until dusk, his large hands, which she had first thought clumsy, moving with an artist's precision. He chose each stone with care, turning it over and over, feeling its weight and shape before fitting it perfectly into place. It was slow, meticulous, beautiful work. He was not merely repairing a wall, he was creating something solid and permanent from the rubble. He never addressed her or Finn directly, but his awareness of them was constant. Each morning, a small offering would appear on the rickety porch rail, or a bird's egg with a perfect blue shell, a cluster of wild berries, or, one day, a single, perfectly ripe apple, polished to a shine. He left them without ceremony and walked away, never waiting for thanks. He was feeding them, providing for them, in the only way he knew how. One afternoon, watching Silas heft a massive stone into place with a grunt of effort, Finn, for the very first time, took a tentative step off the porch and stood at the edge of the barn, his gaze fixed not in fear, but in something akin to awe. The fragile piece shattered with the arrival of a dust-covered buggy. Ilara's heart seized when she recognized her uncle Jedediah swinging himself down, his boots kicking up clouds of dirt as if the land itself offended him. He strode toward the cabin with an air of arrogant ownership, his eye sweeping over the small signs of life with a contemptuous sneer, the cleanly swept porch, the neat stack of firewood, the mended barn wall. "Playing house, are we?" he drawled, his voice a poison that soured the clean air. He ignored Ilara completely, his gaze landing on Silas, who had stopped his work and was standing motionless by the barn, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "I've come for my share," Jedediah announced, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Ilara's feet. "The arrangement was that I get a cut of this farm's earnings for my trouble." Ilara's blood ran cold. There were no earnings. There was nothing but dirt and stone and a few handfuls of flour. Silas remained silent, his stillness a stark contrast to Jed's agitated blustering. He simply moved, placing his large body in the space between Jedediah and the cabin porch, a silent, immovable shield. The gesture, so simple and instinctual, spoke volumes. He was protecting them. Enraged by the silent defiance, Jedediah shoved Silas hard in the chest. It was like shoving an oak tree. Silas didn't even flinch, his feet planted firmly in the earth he was so patiently trying to heal. His eyes, however, lost their placid emptiness and hardened into chips of granite. "This ain't over, you dumb ox," Jedediah snarled, jabbing a finger at him. "This land, this whole pathetic rock pile, is tied to me. I'll be back for what's mine, and I'll strip it bare." He climbed back into his buggy and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, suffocating dread in his wake. The echo of Jedediah's threat lingered in the air long after his buggy had disappeared over the rise, a toxic miasma that choked the quiet progress they had made. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer peaceful or contemplative, it was heavy, fraught with the shared anxiety of a future that had just been stolen from them again. Elara prepared a simple stew, the aroma filling the small space, a brave attempt to reclaim a sense of normalcy. When it was ready, she ladled it into 3 bowls. Instead of eating on the porch as she usually did, she placed a bowl at the head of the small table. She looked at Silas, who stood hesitating by the door, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the empty chair. It was the first invitation she had ever extended. He watched her for a long moment, then slowly, as if unsure of his right to be there, he moved to the table and sat down. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the scraping of spoons against ceramic. Finn, seated between them, seemed to sense the shift, his eyes darting from Elara's face to Silas's. When the meal was finished, Elara folded her hands on the table, the lamplight casting long shadows on the wall. "He took our farm," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the stillness. "After Pa died. Said we couldn't work it. Said it was for our own good." The confession, simple and unadorned, hung between them, a fragile bridge of shared experience. Silas stopped wiping his bowl with a piece of bread. He lifted his head, and for the first time, Elara saw past the shame and the quiet resolve in his eyes, glimpsing a deep, ancient well of hurt. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse, like stones grinding together. "My father built this place," he said, his gaze fixed on the stonework of the hearth. "With his own hands. They called him a fool, too. Said the land was worthless." A new purpose settled over Silas in the days following Jedediah's visit. The work on the farm was no longer just about repair, it became an act of defiant creation, a testament of belonging carved into the very earth Jedediah sought to claim. He worked with a feverish, focused energy, his quietness transformed from passive endurance into a powerful, creative force. He finished the barn wall, the stones fitting together so perfectly it looked as though the hill had grown it itself. Then, he turned his attention to the cabin. He tore out the old, crumbling fireplace and, using stones he quarried from a nearby ridge, began building a new hearth. It was magnificent work. Each stone was chosen and placed with reverence, the structure rising solid and beautiful, a warm, beating heart for their small home. His creativity wasn't confined to the stone, however. In the evenings, by the light of a single lamp, he began to carve. He took scraps of wood, pine, oak, willow, and his large, surprisingly nimble fingers would coax life from them. He carved small, smooth-lined animals, each one imbued with a quiet personality. One evening, Elara was tucking Finn into bed when she saw it. Sitting on the small crate next to the bed, right beside Finn's worn, familiar bird, was a newly carved horse. It was a perfect miniature, its head arched, its wooden muscles taut as if ready to run. Silas had left it there, another silent offering, but this one felt different. It wasn't sustenance, it was a gift. It was hope, carved from a piece of wood. Elara's throat tightened. She watched as Finn, his eyes wide with wonder, slowly reached out. He didn't snatch it, but touched it reverently, his small fingers tracing the smooth, flowing lines of the carving. And then, for the first time in over a year, the ghost of a smile touched his lips. When the flour sack finally ran empty, Elara knew she could not put off the trip to the general store any longer. She bundled Finn in her shawl, her stomach tightening with a familiar dread as she thought of the whispers, the mocking eyes, the pity that felt worse than the scorn. The walk to town was long, and with every step, she braced herself for the social gauntlet she would have to run. As she pushed open the door to the store, the little bell above it announcing her arrival, a hush fell over the few patrons inside. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her short list of necessities. But the expected wave of whispers never came. Mr. Henderson, the store owner who had barely acknowledged her at her own wedding, greeted her with a curt but respectful nod. He said, his tone devoid of its usual condescension. As she waited for him to weigh out the flour, a woman whose name she didn't know, a woman whose own husband was the town drunk, caught her eye. She gave Ilara a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement of shared hardship and a surprising salute to her resilience. It was then Ilara realized something had shifted. Their story, the joke of their wedding, had evolved. They were no longer just the town's spectacle. Word of Jedediah's cruelty, of Silas's quiet labor, and of her own steady dignity had spread. They had become a different kind of story, one of defiance against the odds. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, clutching her meager provisions, she saw a large figure detach itself from the shadows of the alley across the street. It was Silas. He had followed her, keeping his distance, a silent, steady guardian ensuring she was safe. He met her eyes from across the road, and in that shared glance, she felt a profound sense of partnership, a silent promise that she was no longer facing the world alone. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a storm brewing on the horizon, when Jedediah returned. This time, he was not alone. He brought two hard-faced men with him, hired muscle whose eyes were as empty as their morals. He dismounted his horse with a flourish, waving a piece of paper in his hand. The eviction notice, he announced to the wind, his voice full of venomous glee. Signed and sealed by the magistrate. This land is mine. You have 1 hour to get your pathetic things and get out. Ilara came to stand on the porch, her body a frail but unyielding barrier in front of the cabin door. Finn, sensing the terror, clung to her skirts, his face pale. Just as one of Jed's men took a swaggering step forward, Silas emerged from the barn. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, placing himself directly in front of Ilara and Finn. In his right hand, he held a heavy stonemason's hammer. He did not raise it like a weapon, he simply held it, the weight of it familiar in his grip, an extension of his own solid, unmovable self. His gaze was fixed on Jedediah, his expression calm, his silence more potent than any shouted threat. "This is my home," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the weight of absolute conviction, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath his feet. He then shifted his gaze slightly to include Ilara and Finn. "This is their home." Jedediah let out a harsh, barking laugh, but it sounded hollow against Silas's certainty. The hired men glanced at each other, their bravado faltering. There was something unnerving about the big man's stillness, a sense of deep, untapped power that their employer's money had not prepared them for. "Get them out!" Jedediah shrieked, his face purpling with rage. He shoved one of his men forward, and the fragile piece shattered, the world holding its breath on the precipice of violence. Just as Jedediah's men tensed to move forward, the distinct sound of another wagon rattling up the lane cut through the thick tension. All heads turned to see the town sheriff's buggy pull to a stop, Mr. Henderson, the store owner, sitting grim-faced beside him. The woman from the store, the one who had nodded at Ilara, had seen Jedediah ride out with his hired thugs and had wasted no time. The sheriff, a weary man who valued quiet order above all else, climbed down and surveyed the scene, Jedediah's sputtering rage, the nervous hired men, Silas's granite-like stillness, and Ilara's fierce, protective stance on the porch. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, not with a weapon, but with his own ledger book. "Sheriff," he said, his voice steady, "Jedediah tried to pull this same trick with the Miller deed 5 years ago. I have the records. His signature on that paper his waving is about as real as his piety." The sheriff took Jed's document, his eyes scanning it, then looking up at the magnificent new stonework on the barn and hearth, solid testaments to Silas's claim. He saw the truth not on the forged paper, but in the family standing before him. He handed the deed back to Jed. "Get off this property, Jedediah," he said, his voice flat and final. "And don't come back defeated and exposed." Jedediah's bluster evaporated, leaving only a pathetic, shriveled man. He scrambled onto his horse and fled, his hired men slinking away behind him. As if on cue, the heavens opened and the rain began to fall, a cleansing torrent washing the dust and the hate from the air. In the quiet aftermath, Silas finally let the hammer hang loose at his side. He turned and looked at Ilara, a question in his eyes. And then, a small miracle occurred. Finn, who had been hiding behind his sister, took a tentative step forward. He let go of Ilara's skirt, walked across the rain-slick porch, and for the very first time, reached out and slipped his tiny hand into Silas's large, calloused one. The sun broke through the clouds, bathing the small farm in a warm, golden light. They stood together, the outcast, the orphan, and the silent child, no longer three broken people, but a family, solid and beautiful as new stone. Thank you for watching. The smallest act of kindness can change a life. If you were moved by this story, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more emotional content. Share your thoughts in the comments below, we love hearing from you.